Swami Kriyananda lived until his mid-80s. I think he was 86 when he died. And his health was poor for a long time at the end of his life. Well, he had a lot of issues all the way through. He used his body to help work out karma, not only for himself, but in lots of other ways. When I commented to him once, this isn't your own illness, he said, well, you have a body, you might as well make use of it. Yogananda offered us many very challenging teachings. In the bookstore here, there's a 3-volume set of that was written by my friend Giovanni in Assisi, who from the very beginning of Ananda was always very interested in Master's teachings. If you're at all interested in subtle forms of healing, I highly recommend that book. Basically, it's an encyclopedia of every healing technique that Master ever said anywhere. Shivani is, if nothing else, she's not thorough. She's extremely thorough. So she just wrote this manual of more subtle forms of healing. And Master says things like, with your willpower, you can regenerate a severed limb. So it's not like he had a small idea of what the human will could do. But on the subject of working out other people's karma through your own vehicle, he never said a word except a secret yogic technique. It's very interesting because it's not something that the ego can decide to do. It's a God-given way of serving that many of the great masters use. This is the actual story of the crucifixion of Jesus, which has been made into a church principle, which is absolutely true. Jesus died for our sins. And because Jesus died on the cross, we are forgiven or liberated from whatever vocabulary you use, but his death affected our salvation. Master refined that understanding in a really just simply interesting way, which is once that body was gone, that body couldn't be re-sacrificed over and over again. We're working with subtle but simple laws. The divine laws appear miraculous and unusual to us only because we're not at the level where we see them. I have no idea why I can receive an email. I have no idea why when I'm in Europe, I can just pick up my little thing and poke a few buttons and then be talking to my friends in California. Even seeing their faces, they can show me the sunset. It's just, I have no idea how any of that works. I just know that it works. And so we are just as mystified by things that are perfectly natural. I've always been amused sometimes when I remember some particular film that I saw only once, where Jesus was performing miracles, and God bless the director for even trying to present such a thing on film. But the only way that the director could understand that much power was by, super intense physical energy. So when Jesus is turning the water into wine, his face, he has a grimace, all his muscles are tensed, he's working as hard as he can, he breaks out in a sweat, as if it was like lifting, like powerlifting in some Olympic contest, to get the water into wine, because they just didn't understand all the subtle way that all of this is done. But the most interesting thing about spiritual life is you see that it's not alien to who we are. And it is not something that you can or should put on from the outside. I'll tell a sequence of stories here that was very interesting for me in learning this point. On one of the trips to India, I seem to be talking about India. I know Isha Das was in India recently, and of course many of you have traveled there. And it's kind of our karmic homeland in certain ways, because we're born with these faces and this skin, and we don't have the accent. But nonetheless, there's an attunement with a different way of looking at things. This is God's plan for bringing the world all together. So one of our last pilgrimage trips, last time that I did that kind of thing, we went up to Badrinath, which is at about 10,000 feet or 11,000 feet. And somebody in the Ananda world had met this hermit, this sadhu, who lived a few thousand feet higher up. So we hiked up to his little kutir. And this man was called Boxwala. And that the word is English, box. And wala means like you have a laundry wala or the tea wala, someone who's responsible. And this man was called Boxwala Baba. At first you thought this is some subtle word. Then you realize the word is box. There it is. So we go up to this, we walk up to this kutir, little tiny cottage where he lives. He happens to be in silence. So he's writing in Hindi on his slate, and our guide is translating, and we're sitting around on the floor looking out the window at these mountains, and we're hearing the story of Boxwala Baba. And I don't know what incarnation I'm in. I don't know what planet I'm on. I'm just, wow, I've never been this high in the mountains. Was this my kutir in the past? Just all those things start floating through your mind. So Boxwala is called that because there are two tiny rooms in his cottage there. There's this big metal box. And the snow is so deep there that even the Badrinath temple, which is a very famous temple dedicated to Babaji, and there's this stone that is not carved, but looks like the sitting posture, the statues, like this statue that you see, which is Babaji here. There's this natural stone that is the center point. But the snows are so deep that when the snow comes, they carry the whole thing down to Josimat, which is only at 7,000 feet. And so Babaji spends the winter in Josimat. And then all the sadhus come out of the mountains too, because it's just the snow is too deep. Except for Boxwala Baba. Boxwala Baba does not come down from the mountain. He goes into a state of deep samadhi and gets into his box. And the reason he does that is so that no animal will eat his body. So he spends the winter months in the box, but in his spirit he goes and spends it with Babaji in the Himalayas. So this is the story that unfolds while we're sitting there with this Indian man whose voice we're not even hearing because he's writing on the tablet. So this is, entertaining at the very least, and extremely interesting, and I think the word is mind-blowing. Is that the word I'm looking for? So by now, whatever year this was, 2006 or something, Swami Kriyananda has a home in India. In 2004, at the age of 77, he felt called to start an Ananda work, so he goes back there. So in the course of the same tour, we end up in Delhi, and I'm with Swamiji in his home, and we're talking. He's heard by now about Boxwala Baba. He said, "What did you think? What was your impression of Boxwala Baba?" I said, "Sir, I didn't know what was inspiring me. I didn't know what was happening up there. I was in an altered state, but I don't know if it was Boxwala's consciousness or what it was. But yeah, something was really happening." But then I put it like this, "But sir, he was so casual about just going in the box for the winter and then go spending time, And I said, he just made it seem like it was so natural." Swami, who always surprised me, I'm a fairly bright person, but he would just take it somewhere else. And so when I said the obvious, well, he was a little casual about, something so unusual. And Swami said, well, at a certain point it is just natural. And then a little while later, on this same trip, I was in Bangalore, and Ananda had a center there. This was all, at that time we were just starting these things. It was the first time I was in Bangalore, first time meeting the Ananda devotees there. And we were just getting acquainted. They're asking me questions about my own spiritual life, which is we get to know each other. How did you come on the path? What was your background? Natural things. And so I'm telling them I met Swami Kriyananda when I was 22. Soon after, I just gave up everything I was doing. I moved to the ashram. I never looked back. Now, self-evidently, I'm American, and everyone I was talking to was Indian. The cultural relationships with family are quite different. So this lovely group of Indian devotees, in their way, my friend Atul, who was born in Delhi, always laughs when I say this. But so they said to me, "And what did your parents think?" And in response, I said, "It never occurred to me to ask them." And this little ripple goes through. She never asked her parents. She just moved like this, you know. But then, interestingly, you see, and one part of Swami's genius as a teacher, truthfully, is he could always make a bridge between the most exalted and, I want to say, the most ordinary, but what I mean is where we were actually standing. And I'm seeing myself suddenly. Of course, I am American. I always have to say to Indians, you know, I'm American. I'm not culturally Indian. So he could always make a bridge. So I'm sitting there and I'm seeing myself through their eyes. And the idea that at the age of 22, I would just leave everything behind and go live in this ashram at a time when, I mean, this is like 1970. This was not an ordinary thing for anybody to do it in the USA at that time, especially. But at a certain point, it seems natural. Like, why would I have asked anyone about that? I was obviously born for that, and now it's perfectly clear. But there was never a moment of hesitation. And I thought, from their side, it looked radical. From my side, it seemed perfectly natural. And I could just see how, step by step by step, we become attuned to a more and more subtle reality. But when we become attuned to it, it's not weird or remarkable. It's just obviously the way things are. And that's what real spirituality is. Real spirituality is not some radical, sudden departure from who you are. It's just gradually growing into a suit of clothes. You know, when parents are raising children and you're watching their bodies shift so radically, sometimes you put them in clothes that are just a little too big. But you always put them in clothes that are just enough too big that they can still function, but that won't break the bank because they're only going to wear them for a week or two. And that's exactly how Divine Mother works with us. She has us wear a suit of clothes that's just a little bit too big, but so that it feels natural, and then we can gradually sort of fill out the spaces. And then either we willingly will trade that suit in for a bigger one, or we bust the seams, and all of a sudden we don't have anything to wear, so we have to think about, you know, accepting the new reality. I had a very interesting experience with my own parents in this respect. I basically left home when I was 18, and I never really lived in my parents' house again after that. I have great respect for my parents. They were lovely. My father was a powerful moral influence on me. Toward the end of their lives, in response to the question I was asked about age, I really wanted my parents toward the end of their lives to know that they'd done a good job. And I wrote a note to my father about the powerful ethical and moral training that we received from him. I said, you raised 3 children who cannot drop a gum wrapper on the street. You know, it's just like we were so clear about what was appropriate behavior, not in trivial ways, but in profound ways. You know, I can't even litter, what to speak of lie or be dishonorable, because of his influence. And my mother just loved us. She was wonderful in that respect. She loved being a mother. I asked her once, what was your favorite time? And with that really sweet nostalgia, she said, when you 3 children were little and you belonged to me. You know, oh, there we are, collective, oh, yeah, exactly. But at the same time, in a very real sense, I belonged to Swami's family. I got a body from my parents. I was raised well, but I was born for something else. However, at the end of my parents' life, my mother had Parkinson's. My father took care of her for a long time, and then it was a little too much for him, so he went on a little mental holiday. The last couple of years of his life, he just decided to check out. And in a very sweet way. He became very dear, but I'm just going to riff for a minute. My mother died first. My father lived 2 years longer, and he was in a memory care place by that point. I got a phone call from the staff. I get this call, and the call is, "Don't worry, we called poison control, and it's not a problem." Which is like not an ideal beginning, just to advise you. I said, and? Like, what are we talking about? God bless him. My father, who always was enthusiastic about his meals, was sitting at the table where there was all these dishes on the table, plus a flower arrangement. And without having, the rational part of his brain, he saw the flower arrangement, he saw the potatoes, he saw the vegetables, so he ate the potatoes, the vegetables, and the flowers. And by the time they noticed, he'd consumed one or two, but apparently they weren't poisoned, so it was all okay. I started to laugh, and when I started to laugh, of course, the caregiver started to laugh too, because it was really quite funny. But they didn't want to start with that. They needed to make sure. Okay. When my parents' life first began to disintegrate, I'm very executive. I have a lot of willpower, and I presume that my interference is welcome, which is not always true. I tried to take over their life. They lived some hundreds of miles away, so that involved a lot of plane flights, but I just went down to reorganize their lives so it would look more like what I thought it should look like. It was well-intentioned. It was utterly misguided, but it was well-intentioned. And those of you who are parents may suspect it wasn't welcome either, right? We had very different personalities. We dealt with life very differently. I just started trying to make their life be what I think it should be. It did not create harmony. It did not create what I wanted to create. So I began to ask the question, what's wrong with this picture? What was wrong with this picture? And this is what I began to think, like, good Lord, Asha, at this time, 40 years of spiritual teaching, maybe you have a clue what's really going on. And I thought quite simply, this sounds so silly, this is my parents' karma. And it's not karma that just fell on them, yesterday. It's like for incarnations, my parents have been working themselves up to this particular moment. So much of what's in all scripture and in many of the words of Jesus said, Lord, spare me from this hour. Forgive me if I'm not exactly quoting it. Speaking of being crucified and the whole story. And then he said, let this cup pass from me. Spare me from this hour. But in that context, he also said, for this hour was I born. And then, when we hear the trumpets and we see the band of angels marching in, for this hour was I born. That can be said for everyone in this room for being right here. We have been working for incarnations to get here. Our soul is the river seeking the sea, and we have been seeking the sea from the moment we were created. From the moment we were separated, we've been trying to get back, and everything that has happened to us in all the incarnations, whether we remember them or not, have been very carefully building for this moment to give us the opportunity once again to move toward the light. And so I started thinking of my parents. These lessons come. All of creation is divine. You can't say everything is God's will except this little part of the tapestry, and I'm going to cut this out. It's completely separate. It has nothing to do with. This is what I was saying last night. If karma is true anywhere, it's true everywhere. And I realized my parents want to have this experience. They're not waiting for me to protect them from learning what they have to learn. And then it got even more interesting. Why am I doing this? Is it really for them or is it for me? Your life makes me uncomfortable. You have to be different. seemed very reasonable when I was doing it. And then a very interesting thing came to me, and you just learn all this little by little, because I do have a lot of willpower and a lot of energy. My parents were not the only life I was trying to manage, you know? I was rushing in here, there, and everywhere to keep people from having to face their own karma. Like, why am I doing this? And then I had to think, at that stage, at this stage even stronger in my life, I'm not afraid of my karma anymore. I still have a little bit of fear about being imprisoned and tortured. That does scare me quite a bit. But even that doesn't scare me as much as it used to. I asked Swami once, or someone else asked him, how can you tell when you've finished, when you've really worked out karma? He said, when it doesn't frighten you anymore. Isn't that? Anything you're still afraid of, there's a little bit that you're going to have to face. Now, that doesn't mean, for example, that you'll have to be imprisoned and tortured, but it means that somehow you have to become fearless. If everything is the will of God, why would I be afraid? But what I realized was I was not afraid of my own karma, because I recognize if it comes to me, well, let's put it this way. If there was a shorter, easier route to divine freedom, my Divine Mother loves me. She would take me that way. I mean, think always, but a mother will discipline her child. I'm going to tell you a mother-daughter story, a mother-son. This woman came to our path many years after her son was an adult. But when she heard me talking about various things, talking about the astral world and choosing your rebirth, she tells me the story about her son. She disciplined her son in some way. He was 5 at the time. And she was a good mother, and so he was very displeased with what she was imposing upon him, but she wasn't going to back down. And he started to stomp away in anger, as children do, and then he came back to her. First he said, I hate you. You're a terrible mommy. And then he turned around and stomped away. But then he decided that wasn't enough. He comes back and he says, you weren't even my first choice. At that time, she knew nothing about reincarnation or anything, but she was intrigued. She said, honey, who was your first choice? And he answered, a woman in the Philippines, but she was taken. Now, she brings this incredible story to me because I had repeated something that Master said. Master said, when you're in the astral world and it's time for you to be reincarnated, he said, when the sperm and the ovum unite in the physical world, in the act of sexual intercourse, when the sperm and ovum unite, there's a flash of light in the astral world. And those souls that are ready to be incarnated, that match that vibration, and these were the words that Lisa's repeated, I heard them, souls rush to get into that womb. And he said sometimes more than one gets in. Okay, but this sounds like there's a competition. You know, like that looks like a good one. I'm going to go run to that one. And when she heard all that, she said this was her son's temperament. He would have a desire to do something, and he would start moving toward it, but then he'd stop and think about it for a minute. She could see him heading for that woman in the Philippines, but then stopping for a moment to think about it. Darn it, someone else got in. Whether any of that's true or not, but it's true enough. You know, that's how all these things work. Okay. You know, coming back to wherever we were, if I can find it now. Oh, yes, talking about my parents, talking about being afraid of my own karma and all of that. But I realize at this point in my life, whatever happens, you know, if God sends it to me, there's a good reason. And I might not enjoy it. I might wish for this cup to pass from me, but thy will, not mine, be done. Oh, if there was an easier way to get to God, Divine Mother would take us that way. She only disciplines us when she knows it's necessary for our well-being. And everything that happens to us potentially has the possibility of making us freer. Not rather than more bound, more small. So what we're working with, very simple principle. We're contracted. We're contracted in our self-definition. We're contracted in our concept of what is good. A woman came to me when I was working at the retreat at Ananda Village. She came all the way from Sweden. This was again like in the 70s when people didn't travel nearly so easily. She travels all the way to California from Sweden to learn Master's teachings because there weren't many options even in the world at that point. And she was there because she had had a sister who was very close to her in age. They grew up together and they planned their whole lives out together. Hopefully they would marry brothers. They would live next door to each other. They would raise their children together. They had a whole life plan that they'd planned from when they were little girls. However, in her 20s, her sister got cancer and her sister died. And so everything that this poor woman had planned and hoped for, she just felt devastated. She was so crushed by the experience that she turned to God for solace because there was no solace in this world. And as a consequence, as she put it, she prayed with an intensity that she didn't even know she had. As a result, she got a response from God that she didn't even know was possible. So now she's studying Master's teaching, she's learning to practice Kriya, this whole world of possibility is open to her. And that's why she's there in California talking to me about this. So I took an intuitive risk. I said, given all that's opened up to you, given the enormous expansion of awareness that has been caused by the death of your sister, was her death a blessing or a tragedy? Which is a daring thing to ask. And the woman just, you can't answer that question easily. In other words, was there a divine purpose behind what happened here? How do you say it? Because we use the word good and bad very casually. But we think good, well, it's real easy. If it's easy and pleasurable, it's good. And if it's challenging and forces us to learn something we don't already know, and it's painful, we tend to call it bad. But we don't even know the rules of the game. We don't know which set of goalposts belong to us. And we cope by getting smaller. But the only way to really overcome is to expand. So I'm thinking about my parents, and I don't know how much you all know about Parkinson's, but let's just say it's not pretty. Dementia was sort of fun for my father because he'd been a super Virgo. And when his mind slipped a little, he forgot what he was worried about. And his basic sweet nature just came forward. He forgot all the details that he was supposed to be concerned about. Just became what was his essential nature. But the Parkinson's was tough. To give my mother credit, somewhere, she was sick for about 10, maybe even 15 years. At some point, she says to me like this, I hate to admit it, but this disease has been the making of me. And she was right. Very good woman, but lacking in willpower. And the Parkinson's gave her willpower. She'll be much more powerful in her next incarnation. So I'm watching all of this, and I realize I'm trying to prevent them from growing. That's precisely what I'm doing. They need this lesson, and I'm trying to keep them from having it. That's just like the mother who says, I never want hear my children cry. Whoa, why don't we just ruin their lives then? Because I will never have to listen to them cry then. Divine Mother is much wiser than that. So actually then it comes down to which St. John in the Bible, perfect love casts out all fear. What am I afraid of? And that's a magnificent prayer. In a small group yesterday or the day before, I believe, I was talking about an experience I had with Swamiji, and I'm going to repeat it here. I was faced at that point in my life with a very either-or choice. No middle ground. The door on the right, the door on the left. There weren't three. One thing I've observed over many years of counseling, a lot of people, including me at times, spend a lot of energy seeking what I call the mythical third alternative, right? And it makes us feel like we're really engaged, but we're really searching for another option when there isn't another option. One option will be expansive, one option will be contractive, and neither of those things appeal to us. So we look for the mythical third alternative. So I was in that one, but I was couching it in this deep desire to know what God wanted of me and this tragic inability to know because God was not telling me. So I would spend a great deal of time pleading with God to show me, right? And so finally this anguish crested and I went to see Swami Kriyananda, and he was sitting in this ottoman, this chair, and he was sitting in a soft chair, and there was an ottoman, a hassock in front of me. I'm on the other side of the hassock. He was so patient with me, I just can hardly believe it. I'm pouring out this tale of woe, and he's very sympathetic. He's not commenting, but he's very sympathetic. I tell him, and then finally, overcome with the anguish of my situation, I threw my head down on the couch and began to sob like this on the hassock. And then I lifted my eyes and said, "It's so hard to know what God wants," like this. And Swami said, "No, it's not." Not unkindly, but just like, sun rises in the west. No, it rises in the east, or, just like whatever it was. And then I just waited for something else. Nothing else happened, so I got up. I lived about 2 minutes away from where he lived, and I started back to my little trailer. Very, very interesting. By the time I got to my trailer, which was just a 2 or 3 minute walk away, I had shifted what he said to be more flattering for me. And what I turned it into was Kriyananda saying, "I, Kriyananda, don't have any trouble knowing what God wants." And I got all the way to my little house, and I sat down to meditate, trying to sort this thing out. And that's when I realized that I had already changed what he said. And then I realized he did not say that he didn't have any trouble. He said, "It is not hard to know," which raised a completely different question in my mind. And the question in my mind became, well, it's bloody hard for me to know. So how come I don't know? So by now I'm having an inner dialogue with Swami. He says, just very cheerfully, "Because you don't want to know." And then first I protest, "Yes, I do. Yes, I do." But then I listened. I said, "Why don't I want to know?" He said, "Because you don't like the answer." It was as simple as that. There were two choices. I had a strong preference, and I was not going to get what I wanted. So instead of just saying, "I'm not going to get what I want," I pretended to be confused, which has led me ever since. Whenever I don't know, I stop asking. That's the wrong question. If you do not get an answer, you're asking a question that has no answer. See, we think in such detailed terms about this world, like it really matters. Like, should I live in Rochester or should I live in Buffalo? Rochester, Buffalo, Rochester, Buffalo. God, which one do you want? Should I take this job? Should I take that job? Quite frankly, God doesn't give a damn, because it's not about circumstances, it's about our consciousness. How can I serve? How can I love more? A woman wrote to Swamiji once, and it was a question for her whether she should leave 10 years of the monastic life or get married. And she said, "I keep praying, I don't get an answer." And there was a man in the picture. It was not a theoretical question. I can't decide, I don't feel. Swami said, "It doesn't matter, take either choice." You would think, well, it must matter. After all, it's my life, must matter. No, he said, as long as God is pleased that you want to live for him, he doesn't care about the details. So I began in my life, and I've used it ever since, what am I afraid of? Because that's always the question. What am I afraid of? Well, I immediately knew I was afraid that I was not going to get what I wanted. I was afraid that I would suffer, blah, 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 on and on like that. But if everything happens by the will of God, And if everything is equally an opportunity for us to grow closer to the divine, and Master put it this way, difficult karmic tests are not sent to break us. They are sent to awaken us to the infinite divine power that we have within us. So we either expand or we contract. But expansion is scary. It's moving us into the unknown. It's telling you that you're more than you already think you are. We often prefer the known misery to the possibility of greater happiness, or we don't recognize this is the path to greater happiness. And that's the source of all our suffering. And that's why the saints are supremely free. Because there's no other. There's only God's will, and this is the most comforting way I think about it, there's a Divine Mother taking care of us. That's all. Divine Mother is taking care of us, the comforter. And Divine Mother, because she really loves us, and the human mother will comfort us, but they won't say you don't have to do it. Not if she really loves you. She won't comfort you by saying, just become smaller and weaker, that'll be good for you. She lets you cry your heart out, and she hands you a Kleenex. Then she gives you your shoes and your sword and sends you back out to do it, but with the power of her love and the confidence of that behind you. So again, going all the way back to my parents, I learned so much from that whole thing, and I began to think, why don't I help them deal with their life in the way that makes sense to them? It was so simple. Instead of trying to make them into me, I tried to help them take their own next step. And yes, of course, everything wasn't all sewn up and protected, and so there was the possibility that I would be profoundly inconvenienced. But if it would help them to be free, why would I not want them to have that experience? This is what karma is. Karma is the necessary experience that will show us what our own potential is. Just an unlearned lesson that we get a chance to learn. Why would we not want to help each other learn? You see, this is the calm reality of the masters. There's a wonderful story about Swami, I think it was Shankaracharya, if I'm not mistaken. He had a disciple, this is apocryphal or true, I don't know. And the story is that one of his disciples was a very anxious woman who was always afraid that something bad was going to happen. And apparently her guru told her that, she should do something, wanted her to take a certain course of action. She said, but what if I die? He said, well, then die. And she did. She just fell over and was dead. It's like, you've always been afraid of this, so here, have it happen to you. Now you're dead. That's how the story is always told, but I'm very interested in what happened next, because her guru was not limited by time and space and life and death. So all of a sudden, she's on the other side, and he hasn't abandoned her. He's on the other side with her, asking the obvious question, and how did that work out for you? And what did they talk about at that point? Okay, your worst fear has been realized, and look, it's nothing. You stepped out of your body and now you're dead. You ran your whole life to avoid this, and now it's happened. Big deal. And that's what's always true. There's nothing that can happen that will separate you from the guidance of God, from the love of Divine Mother, from the power of your own soul, unless you yourself close the door. And this is where I was saying earlier, Swami's so practical, and he put this down in very simple words. We're trying to expand. See, we make up these ways of coping, and there's just really two directions. We either come to greater and greater awareness, and in that greater awareness, that which seemed far away becomes natural. So there's a story in Autobiography of a Yogi, one of the many oh my gosh stories, where this is supposedly true. I mean, it's presented as truth, and Yogananda wouldn't. What I'm saying, it's not necessarily apocryphal. This is supposedly factual. There's a dangerous criminal somewhere, and then there's a sadhu walking down the street, and the police have been told that this dangerous criminal is disguising himself as a sannyasi, So when the police see this sannyasi walking down the street, they start following him and they start telling him to stop, stop in the name of the police. Now, apparently the police were rather zealous, overzealous, you might say. One of them had a machete, and when the sadhu just walked peacefully along and ignored the commands of the policeman hacked his arm off, which seems a little drastic. It seems like there would be a way to stop him otherwise. But anyway, the policeman hacked his arm off. The arm falls to the ground. The sadhu picks up his arm, reattaches it. Just, oh yeah, little problem, dropped my purse. Okay. Puts his arm back on, says to the policeman, I'm not the one you're seeking, like this. He didn't flinch. He didn't protest. Nothing. It's just like, you're mistaken. This is not really what you want. No, I mean, the reason that Master put stories like that in his book, the reason that Jesus turned water into wine and raised Lazarus from the dead, I love the story of raising Lazarus from the dead, especially the part where one of his sisters, when Jesus says, open the tomb, and the sister says, Lord, he's been in there for 3 days. And at least my version of the Bible said, he stinketh. I mean, in fact, the word stink is enough, but to have it come across as stinketh was just really too much. He stinketh. Jesus didn't seem to be really concerned about the details. He insisted that the tomb be open. But the reason he did things, and later when Jesus is coming into Jerusalem, for Palm Sunday, for the end, the others, the ones who are against him, say, we really have to kill this man. And then somebody very practically says, and Lazarus too, because as long as Lazarus is walking around, the story of Jesus will never die. So they have to get rid of him. But the reason these things are presented there, the reason Yogananda tells us in his healing techniques, well, if your arm is severed, you just regenerate it with your willpower, is not to make us feel puny, but to make us realize, at some point this will be natural. But it will only become natural. We need to know how high the mountain is. If you're climbing Mount Everest, you need to know how tall it is. And you have to pace yourself in order to be able to do that. But you do not get to the top from base camp without knowing where your feet are. So it doesn't really matter how far we are away from the top. And this is a balance point that we have to learn in spiritual life. We need to know how high the mountain is. I watched this in my earlier years because it was so intimidating to some people to think about how far we had to go. They just lowered the bar, And that's basically what Master called churchianity is. You don't really have to be therefore perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect, or that which I do, ye shall do, in greater things, which are the words that Jesus spoke to us. They just say, just be nice. Just be a little nice, and that's enough. But it's not. You have to know what the height is, but you have to also know where your feet are. And we need some simple rules for how to get there. And it's just that we have to always think to just be a little more expansive and a little less contractive. And even though it doesn't sound like much, this is again where I was starting from, our spirituality grows in a natural way according to who we really are. There's a little apple tree outside my kitchen window, and I get apples from that tree, and there's seeds in those apples. And I can stand in my kitchen looking at the seed, which is real little, and the apple tree is not huge, but it's bigger than the seed. Within this seed is that apple tree. I mean, there's no logic. There's no logical way that the seed looks like the apple tree, but I know it is. But for that seed to become the apple tree, there are countless steps that it has to take. And no amount of impatience or exhorting the seed or criticizing it or punishing it for not being an apple tree, you can't skip one stage. And in fact, an effort To skip a stage will kill the possibility of it becoming a tree. Then you'll have to start over with another seed. So this is the strange balance that we all have to find within ourselves. I am a child of God, eternally loved by the Divine Mother. The infinite lives within me. All of these things. And what I'm going to do next is wash the dishes before I go to bed, which is a little more contractive, a little more expansive, putting out a little more energy than just saying, oh, I'm much too tired. You know, a little better than your worst. If you consistently do a little better than your worst. I had a very upsetting experience with someone once. It was in a public place, and it was the last straw. This is long after I've been on the path, trust me. It was just the last straw. So we're in a public place. So I think, do I begin to scream right now? Do I have to do it here in the department store? No, perhaps I can wait till I get to the street, a little better than my worst. And at the same time, I'm saying, what about Christ-like forgiveness? And I say, not an option, not an option. Okay? But I don't have to scream in the department store, so we can get to the street. Do I have to scream now? And then I also say, Christ-like forgiveness? No, still not an option. You know, finally get all the way home, all the way into privacy, all the way into a more or less normal tone of voice, which does not look like victory, but it was. Because each step of the way, I did a little better than my worst. And if we just make that our habit, you know, God will help us because we're now working on God's side of things. And why do we have to be afraid of the opportunity to grow? And what am I afraid of?